The Intel Xeon W-3175X started life as one of the most scrutinized parts at Computex 2018, after being unveiled as a 5 GHz 28-core part with a chiller behind the scenes. But it has since evolved into a real product that has a lower price point than expected, and it's still overclockable, so it's actually an unlocked Xeon. This isn't the rumored $4,000 and certainly not the rumored $8,000 that we saw online, but instead a $3,000 Xeon CPU with 28 cores. It's about $1,000 more than the 18-core 9980XE and then the AMD 2990WX. Today we're benchmarking the 3175X in Premiere, Blender, Photoshop, gaming workloads, and of course, we're overclocking it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their high-end thermal compounds. Thermal Grizzly makes cryonaut paste for high thermal performance and conductivity without being electrically conductive, so you don't have to worry about shorting components. Cryonaut is particularly good for replacing stock GPU pastes, as cryonaut is a non-curing compound. Learn more at the link in the description below. The 3175X is a sort of difficult part to review because it's, one, really expensive. There are two motherboards that go with it, a Gigabyte board and the ASUS Dominus, which is what we used. And the Dominus isn't even supposed to be available via retail. It's going to be an SI board, a system integrator board for, well, PC building companies, CyberPower et al. And those companies, from what we understand, spend about $1,700 on the board, but we don't have an actual price from ASUS because it's not a consumer part, it's not a retail part. So, that leaves us with this thing, which is a very impressive piece of hardware by all accounts. The motherboard is impressive, the CPU is impressive despite what you may think based on its price or otherwise. As a part standalone, ignoring all other factors, they are impressive. It's just that it's going to be difficult to purchase for a number of reasons, like price or availability of the CPU or the board. So it does make it a bit difficult, but we're going to be focusing on some of the production tests in case you really care about those. And then we're also pushing some of the overclocking angle a bit because that's really where we think this one's going to be the most fun. And for that reason, we have a live stream, which you should have already seen an announcement in the bottom for that. That'll be the day this video goes up, which is Wednesday, the whatever date that is. We'll put it on the screen. And we're going to probably stream at about 6 p.m. Eastern time in the US for that. So check back for the live stream. We're going to be putting it under chilled water and seeing how far the CPU can overclock. But we did do some overclocking on these solutions on the table. So this is an Asetek solution. It is a sort of hacked together cooler that Asetek did. We learned about this years ago, but did not know the processor it would be used for at the time. And the reason it's hacked together is because if you know other Asetek coolers, it's got the same sort of pump block and the same size cold plate as previously, except it's going on a CPU that's almost exactly the size of a Threadripper CPU. That's the size of the 3175X. So this is not the best solution, but it's supposed to be more affordable. I don't know the price of it because I think this is also an SI part. So I don't know what more affordable means, but it's supposed to be more affordable than an EK solution, and ours, unfortunately, one of them got damaged in shipping. But this would be an EK solution as an example, and we saw these at CES just recently. So the Asetek cooler then. In order to overclock on this thing, the affordable one, whatever that may mean, we had to push noise levels to 70 decibels, and as you can tell, it's excruciatingly loud. And then we also had to use a few tricks. So in BIOS, there's a setting that allows you to increase TJ max, or the maximum temperature per core. We increased that to at least 90 degrees. We might push it higher during the stream, probably up to 100, and it gets a bit dangerous. But TJ max stock is 85 degrees Celsius, which is extremely limiting for overclocking. But you can get away with pushing another 5 degrees for sure, and might be able to do more, though we hesitate to recommend more than that. With an extra 5 degrees, though, we were able to achieve a 4.5 gigahertz clock, and our definition of achieve means it passes all tests. So this includes Blender with AVX workloads, not just games. If we just did games, we'd probably get it up much higher. But passing all tests, 4.5 gigahertz 30x mesh just for a quick and easy one. Didn't really try too hard on that. We'll do that in the stream. And we ran all the memory at 3200 megahertz. Standard for our benchmarks, it is 6 channels, so we populated 6 slots and ran 3200 megahertz for our Corsair Vengeance memory. For voltages, we found that we were able to basically be stable at 1.15 volts. It gets extremely hot at these temperatures, so easily 85 degrees, easily throttling at 1.15 volts 4.5, so it's not really 4.5. Increasing TJ max by 5 degrees allows you to get away with it, but you're within 2 degrees to the point where we ran AC just to make sure it didn't throttle during testing. So this is a very hot CPU, and it's because it's 28 cores. So of course it's going to be hot. It's just like Threadripper. The 2990WX is also a very hot CPU once you start overclocking it. And that's just from the density of the parts in the silicon underneath the IHS. Another note, the 3175X is not soldered, so it is using thermal paste. We didn't feel adventurous enough to delit it before the stream. We would like to hopefully get some value out of it before risking that type of damage. But you could theoretically delit it and throw some liquid metal on it. We'll see if Threadripper makes a tool for it, although the volume seems low. And this cooler we'll talk about more later. We'll talk about the coolers during the stream. So the processor itself is what's interesting, but overclocking was pretty straightforward. It's Skylake X. It is Skylake X overclocking. All steps are the same as Sky X. Everything to do with the 9980XE, 7980XE, 7900X, 7960X, any of those, it's the same process for the 3175X for overclocking. So let's get into the benchmarks. We'll talk Premiere, Blender, Photoshop, POV Ray, games, and power consumption as well, and then try and come to some sort of conclusion. Our first test uses Adobe Premiere to encode a real GN clip. The video is an 11-minute truncated GPU review using only A-roll and B-roll clips at 4K 60 and rendered at 45 megabits per second. We'll play some of that file back now so you can get an idea for what's being rendered. The render is CUDA accelerated. It has some Lumetri scopes effects applied to it and some basics, but the majority of the work is still bottlenecking on the CPU. We firmly believe that this is a real-world scenario, knowing most of the tech YouTubers you all watch and what they use to render, and we find this is representative as a workload piece for content creators. H.264 is used as YouTube isn't really ready for prime time on H.265. Our experience has also taught us that Premiere really pushes things like our charts to the GPU. But A-roll and B-roll sections are very heavy on the CPU, at least with the clips and the settings we use. Here's our results chart. Adobe software in general, including Photoshop, really seems to like frequency. Premiere likes cores more than Photoshop does, but is still heavily frequency dependent. The Intel i9-9900K stock CPU completed our render in 24 minutes, or 21 minutes when using QuickSync, which isn't available on the HEDT CPUs that have no IGP. Note that IGP acceleration helps primarily with our charted reviews, which this is not, but they don't do as much for a heavy A-roll and B-roll video like this one. The Intel i9-9980XE stock CPU completed the same render in 22% less time than the 9900K with IGP acceleration, with the $3,000 Intel Xeon W-3175X completing its render in 12 minutes, reducing the time required from the $2,000 9980XE by about 27%. How meaningful that improvement is will depend upon your use case. For professionals, where every single minute counts, like we'll talk about with Blender and Threadripper momentarily, that 27% reduction could be worth it. In exchange for $1,000, that might be value that gets money back when considering employee time and all of the other costs factored in with time. For most of our sort of normal viewing audience, it's pretty rough value when considering the already reasonable performance of the 9900K. So it's just going to depend on how much that time is worth to the individual or the organization. For us, a 27% reduction would add up to several hours of render time per week, but for a hobbyist, it's better value to buy something else, like the 9900K or 8700K. As for Threadripper, it doesn't handle our 4K 60 clip as competitively as it handles our Blender rendering, which we'll look at next. This is an artifact of how applications are built. Premiere is built, at least with this standard YouTube-ready encoding configuration, to favor frequency heavily, and Threadripper does fall behind on that front. Load balancing isn't as even across the cores in Premiere as it is for Blender. You'll see spikes on individual cores a lot more frequently in Premiere, and in this scenario, Intel is more consistent as a good bet for our Premiere benchmarking. Note that Premiere is hugely complex as a program, so it's possible that there are some filters or effects where Ryzen does better than Intel, but we have not yet encountered those in our workloads that we use at GN. For this workload, Intel is firmly in the lead. Blender got a lot of mentions in the Premiere section. Blender is one of the world's most heavily used 3D modeling and animation programs, and is another one that we use in-house for our own 3D work. Andrew, the editor for this video, made our GN intro logo in Blender, shown on the screen now, which has proven to be one of the most intensive render scenes we've ever tested. The scene trace is raised for lighting effects and has high sample counts for cinema-ready quality. Andrew also made our upcoming RAM timing explanation animations in Blender, but we'll only show a short teaser clip of those for this review. We found that AMD's Threadripper CPUs tend to do well with the GN logo animation, for which we'll show some data now. The performance between CPUs changes depending on the type of animation, so we have multiple tests to get a full picture of the lineup. The $3,000 3175X stock CPU completes the GN logo render in 9.3 minutes, functionally equivalent to the $1,800 2990WX, and that's not counting the high board costs for the X599 platforms. Where Intel looked very compelling in the Premiere bench, AMD looks compelling in the Blender tests. A 0.2 minute difference, or about 12 seconds, is well within error margins. We didn't get a chance to overclock our loaner 2990WX, unfortunately, but Intel's 3175X demonstrates that there is limited scaling at this level of performance, even with an OC. Blender is hugely thread dependent and cares about threads more than anything else. Even hyper-threading offers great value in Blender, as illustrated by the difference between the 8700K and the 9600K when both are at about 5 GHz. Overclocking the 3175X does get a time reduction of 8.6%, but the power consumption and noise increases counter much of that gain. Finally, for reference, the $2,000 9980XE CPU completes the scene in 13.8 minutes when stock, with the 7980XE at 4.6 GHz completing the scene in 10 minutes. If you need to save $1,000, the 2990WX or 7980XE might both be considerations, depending on the type of workload, although Threadripper does have generally good value or better value in this scenario. Switching to our chart for the GN monkey head render, the scene you see on the screen now, in the video anyway, we see the performance for multiple types of rendering effects and techniques. This includes material type changes, transparencies, and changes to roughness, and other visual effects to create realistic stress testing. AMD and Intel deviate more in this workload than in our heavily ray-traced GN logo render, with AMD completing the render in 10.9 minutes on the 2990WX, and Intel's 3175X completing in 7.8 minutes, for a 28% render time reduction when both are stock. The 9980XE completes the same scene in 11.6 minutes, demonstrating that the 2990WX maintains a general lead with thread count, but starts to exchange some of its lead with Intel at the high end, depending on frequency. Finally, for the splash render, the 3175X completes in about 9.7 minutes, with the 2990WX at 11.6 minutes and the 9980XE CPU stock at 11.8 minutes. That rough 16% time reduction against either of the $2,000 options is hard to justify in a lot of instances. It's especially difficult since overclocking the 9980XE gets it to nearly tie the 3175X when it's stock, though you could obviously OC that as well and get another 1 minute reduction. It's just a question of if the business considering this option would get benefit daily, in which instance the cost may be worth it. But it really does have to be a business to start making sense, and it does have to be something you're doing regularly enough with such intensity that these differences make an impact to the bottom line, gaining back that $1,000 quickly. Photoshop tends to be more frequency dependent than anything else, as evidenced by this chart. The 9900K is the best value here by a long shot too, and the 3175X only begins to compete once it's been overclocked to 4.5 GHz and is screaming at 70 decibels on the ASUS cooler. Using the Puget System Photoshop benchmark, we simply cannot justify the 3175X for this use case. A much lower end, higher frequency Intel part makes far more sense than these HEDT platforms. There may be Photoshop use cases where it really makes sense, like maybe accompanying photo management tasks, but we could not find them just with the comprehensive Puget benchmark that we use. POV is our last production test in this benchmark. This one positions the 3175X stock CPU at 25 seconds for multi-threaded elapsed time to complete the render, with the 2990WX stock CPU at 27 seconds to complete. The difference is outside of error margins, but generally insignificant. The 7980XE at 4.6 GHz completes in 29.6 seconds, demonstrating that the extra threads in the 3175X are put to work. Overall, though, the $1,000 difference is tough to accept for these leads. Overclocking pushes the 3175X further up the chart, of course, though at the cost of power and significant noise on the ASUS cooler. And then, to be fair, you could overclock the others as well, like the 2990WX. The 3175X holds a bigger lead in single-threaded performance with POV ray, but then again, so does the 9900K. So we'll just look at multi-threaded here. Power consumption is expectedly rather high with this CPU. With Blender and stock settings, the 3175X ends up following the turbo duration limitation set by Intel and followed by ASUS with MCE disabled after the loading period. The power consumption down the EPS 12-volt cables is 312 watts. Remember, this isn't total system power draw, so we are looking at numbers much closer to actual power consumption of the CPU here. The 2990WX ran at about 191 watts during this test, or roughly 16 amps. This is the same logo render that completed in equal times on the 2990WX and the 3175X in the previous charts, and so AMD is significantly advantaged in power consumption for this test, despite Intel being significantly ahead in Premiere testing. Since they're tied here, AMD gains the advantage with the lower power consumption. Overclocking the 3175X gets it up to a staggering 672 watts, which is the highest power consumption we've yet measured without using exotic cooling like chilled water or liquid nitrogen. For perspective, a previous high was the 7980XE at 1.25 volts at about 548 watts, and then the 2990WX at 1.37 volts for 432 watts, although stability was sort of troublesome with that setting. Games aren't really the targeted use case of the $3,000 3175X, clearly, much like they aren't the intended use case of the 2990WX, but we always benchmark games. It is, after all, gamers' Nexus. In F1 2018 at 1080p, the Intel 3175X ended up at 290 FPS average with lows mostly reasonably timed, sans the 0.1% values. We'll look at frame times in a moment to illustrate this behavior. The average frame rate positioning ranks the CPU as functionally equivalent to a 9900K stock CPU. No human could meaningfully tell the difference between the average of 290 and 284 FPS, though the 0.1% lows may be a bit more meaningfully noticeable. F1 2018 likes cores more than most games do, evidenced by the overclocked 3175 managing to land freshly at the top of the chart with its 308 FPS average. And that's within error of the GPU limitations of the 7980XE at 4.6 GHz. The 9900K at 5.2 GHz further illustrates the thread favor in F1 as its performance tops out at 291 FPS average in spite of its higher frequency. Frame times are important here. Remember that we want to see a lower number for frame time, but also one which is consistent frame to frame. From one frame to the next, we don't want to see a delta greater than 8 to 12 milliseconds, as this becomes noticeable to the user as a stutter. This is the data that gets smoothed out in average charts and is even smoothed out by 1% metrics, illustrated in the previous chart. For frame times, we see the 3175 spike to 20 milliseconds once, not too different from the 9900K, but then again spiking to 35 milliseconds, drawing at 8 milliseconds for a bit, and then 34 milliseconds, then it goes back down to 5 milliseconds, then it hits 35 milliseconds, and so forth. This sporadic behavior is jarring to the user, and although not unplayable, the 9900K is a better experience despite its overall lower average FPS. Threadripper also has issues with a lot of the games if left in creator mode, which is when all of its cores are enabled, so this seems to be a pattern with how games perceive the massive amounts of cores of some of these HEDT processors. It may be best, like with Threadripper, to disable some cores or use process lasso to set the used cores for an application to ensure that the game is not getting confused, so to speak, by the high core count. Resolution is the great equalizer for gaming performance among CPUs, as the task instead becomes GPU bound. At 1440p, F1 2018 positions the 3175X at 237 FPS average, which is about where the overclocked variants, the 9700K at 5.1 GHz, and the 9900K all also get stuck. This is a GPU limitation. Assassin's Creed Origins is up next. At 1080p, the 3175X ends up at 133 FPS average stock, which is between the 9980XE at 4.4 GHz and 9700K at 5.1 GHz. This is another instance where it is clearly more sensible to buy a gaming-centric CPU for gaming. Just like Threadripper or other Xeon parts before, you really shouldn't buy the 3175X for a gaming PC. It's fine for use in a workstation PC that also plays games, but it's really not suitable for use as a gaming-only or gaming-primarily CPU. Being the most expensive doesn't make the CPU the best at gaming, though it may help it in being good at its specialized workstation tasks with some gaming on the side. The 3175X is capable in this test, though clearly not a distinctive leader when compared to Intel's cheaper gaming-centric CPUs like the 9900 or 9700K SKUs. 1440p shows mostly the same thing. Despite being up against the GPU bottleneck, the 3175X falls slightly behind the 9900K, likely resultant of lower single-threaded performance when considering the 9900K's higher frequencies. Civilization 6 will be our last one for today. We have more gaming benchmarks, but as this isn't really gaming targeted, we'll cap it here for time. Besides, the conclusion remains the same across all the titles. Civilization 6 looks instead at AI turn time processing versus FPS, which is a more useful metric for grand campaign or turn-based strategy games. Also, one of the more interesting, unique, and useful metrics for CPU benchmarking from a gaming standpoint rather than FPS. For this one, the 3175X technically chart tops, within error margins anyway, at 11.2 seconds when overclocked to 4.5 GHz. Calculated across hundreds of turns and maybe 5 AI players, this would certainly add up when compared to, for instance, an i3 or an R3 CPU or something lower down on the chart. Realistically though, the difference between an 11.2 second turn completion time per player and an 11.4 second time of the 9700K, for instance, isn't going to be noticeable, and the 3175X stock performance is more realistically comparable to a 9900K stock. Again, the 3175X does well. There's nothing wrong here, but it's not like the performance scales linearly with the money spent, at least not in gaming scenarios like these. So as noted, coming to a conclusion on this is difficult. The first thing you need to know if you're buying one is that yes, it is hot if you overclock, and to the point that this thing with, I don't know if those are Delta fans, I haven't taken them off yet, but with these massive fans that spin all three together at 70 decibels, which is very loud, it struggles to keep it cool at 4.5, 1.15 volts, and we had to go up to 1.17 for Premiere with that TJ Maxx offset. So it is difficult to cool, which you need to know if you're overclocking. If you're not overclocking, it's really not so bad. Auto fan speeds keep it within spec, and it's not terribly loud. But overclocking is, of course, one of the major features, and I mean, it's an enthusiast overclocking part. It's something you do if you don't care too much about noise, because you're gonna get a lot of it. But as for the part practically speaking, in Premiere it does very well. It does well enough where if we had an extra one, we'd probably use it in our own render machine. Or maybe when this gets, if it ever does get retired from overclocking, we might keep it around just as a backup or a primary render system, because the speed uplift in our type of rendering is significant. It's less than half of the time requirement versus a 9900K, and it's significantly reduced versus even a 9980XE. So we see scaling in Premiere with cores in a way that doesn't surface in Photoshop, but it still clearly prefers frequency or some other architectural edge that Intel has, because AMD doesn't do quite as well in our Premiere benchmarks as Intel does, especially if you're looking core to core. So very impressive for Premiere. Again, though, it's $3,000 and the board is TBD. We don't even know if you're going to be able to buy either of these things retail. The CPU you probably should be able to buy retail, but ASUS tells us that their board is an SI part and retail might be later. So that leaves you with Gigabyte, and Gigabyte isn't 100% sure what's happening with theirs either. So it makes it sort of difficult to gauge the value, because we don't know what the combined price is. If the boards are truly going to be over $1,000, your functional price of the CPU is obviously much higher than otherwise. But it's good at Premiere. It's just we don't know if the value is good, because we don't know what the motherboards will cost. But assuming they aren't over $1,000, then a business that runs Premiere all day, every day, would get value out of the part. The bottom line would be affected by the speed increase. If you're not a business, then don't buy it, is what it comes down to, unless you're an enthusiast overclocker, because the value just isn't there. But I think everyone probably knows that. This is a business class part. The 9980XE is clearly competitive. The 2990WX is clearly competitive in Blender. If you're doing something that's tile-based rendering, then AMD's Threadripper 2990WX pulls ahead, and well, in value anyway, and in performance, it's just behind. It's functionally tied in some of our renders, and it's a bit behind in some of the others. It just depends on which render it is. So value-wise though, $1,000 less, you might be better off with that. I mean, you could buy a couple of them. You'd probably buy two of the 2990WXs, and two $400 or $500 X399 boards, and be very close to the total cost of one board plus the 3175X, assuming the board prices are very high. And that's certainly something to consider, because if you can, once you're stacking two CPUs versus one CPU and a board, value goes up tremendously for the two, which would be AMD in this instance. So it's a bit of a trade. Depending on what type of workload you're running, this CPU is good. It's just that the price is really difficult to work with, especially because we don't know what the total price is going to be. So as a product, performance-wise, the 3175X is objectively good. It is a leader. Value is where we can't say that. So in Premiere, if you're making money on it, then it's potentially worth it. But then again, a 9980XE is good, and I mean a 9900K with an IGP and QuickSync is extremely good value. So we can't make that decision for you. You're gonna have to gauge, is your business doing enough videos where cutting the render time to the extent that the 3175X does is really worth it. And it has to be the right type of video too, because some of them, like our charts, are GPU accelerated primarily, not really CPU. And you'd have to do some in-house testing to figure that out. For a consumer versus the 2990 in POV, Ray, and Blender, the 2990 is better value. In Premiere, Photoshop, you should buy a 9900K if that's the only thing you ever do. And then, or 8700K. And then Premiere, the 3175X again is in a lead. Gaming, well, I mean, kind of who cares? It's fine. But it's not a gaming CPU, so you shouldn't buy it for only gaming because there's no value there. But I think everyone knows that, just making sure we're on the same page. So that's the CPU, that's our review of it. It is very difficult to come to a conclusion without knowing the rest of the ecosystem. This is an odd part, but a very interesting one. It's just that the value, I mean, first of all, it's Skylake X. It didn't get the changes that you might have thought it would get last year at Computex. It will require chilled water for us to run it at 5 gigahertz, almost certainly. And that's in line with what we learned at Computex as well. So this is not a part for everybody, and it's for very strict enthusiasts who are competing in overclocking, as you'll see in our stream. That's a small audience, and maybe businesses, and in that instance, we'll defer to you to make the decision because we don't really speak with businesses, we speak with consumers. So if you're interested in the part, that's how it performs. Thank you for watching. As always, subscribe for more. We don't know what the boards will cost, but maybe once this video goes up, you will. So let us know what you think. And you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. Check back for the stream. I'll see you all next time.